Welcome to our panel members for our 3:30 to 4:30 panel.
Hi, good afternoon. And thank you so much for being here for this last panel. And I just have to start with a story about a renowned researcher who was invited to speak at a conference. And it was a really, really long conference. And by the time she got up to speak, there was only one person left in the audience. And so she thanked him profusely for being there. And he said, well, you know, ma'am, you're not the last speaker. I'm the last speaker. So all jokes aside, I think it would be really worth the while to be here for this session because it builds on everything that's been said here at this conference, and I think it's really a look at the future. And it focuses on what I think will go down in history as one of the most significant events in the climate justice arena. And in September 2012, Governor Jerry Brown of California signed into law Senate Bill 535, which mandates that 25% of the state's greenhouse gas reduction fund proceeds should benefit disadvantaged communities. And to identify such communities, the state would use Cal EnviroScreen, which is a cumulative impacts screening tool, and California's analog of EPA's soon-to-be-released EJ-Screen. And the fact that this amounts to $272 million for FY 2014-2015 is a statement in of itself. But that only begins to speak to its implications. So in my piece, which I wrote for the EPA's EJ in Action blog on the 20th anniversary of the Environmental Justice Executive Order last year, I call it SB 535 a harbinger of the future. And it was passed with a broad grassroots coalition led by EJ advocates. SB 535 has implications for climate policy, state innovation, sustainable development, community revitalization, equitable development, and environmental justice. So, for example, it is an example of how to foster co-benefits from greenhouse gas reductions for environmentally and economically distressed communities. It's the first time ever that environmental factors and demographic factors play a significant role in determining what constitutes disadvantaged communities. It offers insights into how states may address equity in their greenhouse gas reduction efforts. It offers insights for the potential uses of EJ-Screen. Its lessons are reflected in the recommendations of the Presidential State, Local, and Tribal Leaders Task Force on Climate Preparedness and Adaptation. And offers insights into how to address the issue of cumulative impacts. And lastly, but not least, it offers lessons on the importance of an empowered community voice for transformative environmental decision making. So today, we have the rare opportunity to hear from a group of leaders key to the conceptualization, the passage, and now the implementation of SB 535. And I will introduce them in the order that they will speak. First, Meredith Tarek is the State Organizing Director for the Asian Pacific Environmental Network. She's an EJ leader who helped lead the grassroots coalition that secured SB 535's passage. And she will talk about what is SB 535 and why it's important to overburden communities. Shankar Prasad is a former Undersecretary for Environmental Justice and Science at Cal EPA, a fellow with the Clean Air Coalition, a former member of the National Environmental Justice Advisory Council, and Shankar is the person who conceived of the idea of SB 535 and is known in California as the father of SB 535. Arsenio Mataka is the current Undersecretary for Environmental Justice and Tribal Affairs at Cal EPA, and he is leading the Cal EPA's efforts in the implementation of SB 535, particularly the use of Cal EnviroScreen. And Colleen Callahan is the Deputy Director of UCLA's Luskin Center for Innovation, and she organized a statewide stakeholder process to develop recommendations for criteria on use of SB 535 funds. She will talk about where's the money going, how it was decided that where it's going, and what are some specific examples of benefits. So you have the rare opportunity to hear firsthand the backstory of this harbinger of the future. It's not, what you're going to hear is not just what SB 535 is, but how it came to be. So thank you, and I'll start with you, Mary Grace. Is anyone putting the slides up?
Okay. Hi, I'm Mary Rose Taruk from Oakland, California, by way of the Philippines. I was trained by the Southwest Network for Environmental and Economic Justice over 20 years ago when I was a youth, and we don't sleep in the environmental justice movement and want to make sure you're not sleeping through this panel. And so we're going to start out with a chant. Can you please stand up? I hope you know this chant. I say, up with the people, yeah, yeah. Up with environmental justice, yeah, yeah. Up with solutions, yeah, yeah. And down with pollution, boo, boo. Down with pollution, boo, boo. And down with polluters, boo, boo. And down with climate change, boo, boo. And up with the people, yeah, yeah. Up with environmental justice, yeah, yeah. And up with solutions, yeah, yeah. All right, thank you. All right, so I'm coming from APEN, the Asian Pacific Environmental Network. We are in the leadership of the SB 535 Coalition. We organize low-income Asian Pacific American families, low-income families, immigrant, refugee families for the multiracial movement for environmental justice. Today we're going to talk about how we're organizing different communities in California, Black, Brown, Asian families in California under what we see as climate solutions from the ground. And so, as you can see from my slides, engaging environmental justice communities for transformative climate investments. All right, so we know that environmental justice communities, so the top picture is from the Richmond Chevron refinery, where a lot of our members live at the fence line of. And so for APEN, we know that our campaigns for clean air and to clean up oil refineries are very connected to what we need to do to solve climate change, particularly with air pollution. And we also know that there's a climate gap, that low-income communities of color are first and worst hit by climate change, and that we need to find solutions and advocate for and push for solutions that bridge the climate gap. And there's a new way of building off of the solutions that have already been offered to solve climate change from the perspectives of environmental justice communities on the ground. Just want to know, I'm going to ask you a lot of questions to make sure you're not sleeping through this presentation. Who went to the Big People's Climate March in New York? All right, so maybe a third of the folks? Great, and who noticed that the front of the march were frontline environmental justice communities? Yeah, and so for us, it was important to organize for our folks to be at the front lines of the march as well, because we have solutions that we've been cultivating on the ground, whether they're over 500 years, 1,000 years old from our communities, that we are in harmony with the earth, and that these solutions are not necessarily new, but they have not been funded before. And so how do we make sure that environmental policy moving forward is not just about environmental policy, but also about economic transformation and benefits, and that we're bridging equity issues, and that we need to lead climate solutions with equity and these 3 E's in mind. Who's heard of California's AB 32 Global Warming Solutions Law? Okay, most folks. Great. So this is an example of a climate solution that has been in the book since 2006, but I think from environmental justice communities in California, we know that we haven't completely been integrated into the programming of AB 32 and these climate solutions. We're very excited about the fact that the AB 32 is going to reduce pollution from these climate polluters that are in our neighborhoods. And there's all this different programming, whether it's transportation or energy or industry, and we want to make sure that programming is actually happening in our communities on the ground. So when they say we're going to set up solar panels in the desert with giant solar farms, or we're going to make sure there's electric cars for folks, and then we don't see those in our communities, then those are not necessarily solutions for everybody, but just a select few. And so we need to bridge those gaps. So SB 535, Senator Kevin DeLeon's bill, carried by many environmental health and environmental justice organizations, knew that we needed to integrate environmental justice into AB 32, and that the investments and programming that was happening needed to be put into legislation because it wasn't happening already. And so over the 4 years that it took us to pass this law, we had built a coalition of over 200 leaders from various sectors, groups, as well as elected officials. And because we wanted to be part of it. We had solutions, and we wanted to be a part of this coalition. And so those over 200 supporters, once we passed this law in 2012, we knew that if the agencies knew how to make sure these climate programs were benefiting low-income communities of color, that they would have been doing it by now. And so we realized that we needed to keep and grow our coalition after the law was passed in order to make sure that the implementation of this landmark investment program for climate projects would be done successfully. And so we kept our coalition together. We knew that this information had to go out because the agencies weren't doing it. And so in the last 2 years, we've hosted over 20 webinars and workshops with our coalition members, and then also expanding the coalition to the folks that are in these environmental justice communities who had not heard of the program before. We also needed to know what greenhouse gas reducing programs were already in place. And so we took a survey of folks in these communities. And so there's also this mismatch of programs that we have been doing on the ground. So whether that's transit, bus service through our communities, or transit passes for youth and seniors, that they hadn't been recognized as greenhouse gas reducing programs before, but they indeed are. And so, so in our survey, we found those types of programs that integrated greenhouse gas reduction with programs that the community was familiar with. So you'll see, transit operations is there, affordable housing next to transit hubs, renewable and efficient energy, community greening, urban forestry and tree planting, things like that, as well as clean freight. And got the state to recognize that those were indeed programs that could be funded through our climate program. We prioritize these 5 programs for investment. So under energy, freight, housing, transit, and urban forestry, we fought for the programs to get integrated into our 3-year greenhouse gas reduction investment fund. And we have all 5 of those programs funded annually. And this is the first year, 2014-15, that the program was rolled out. And there's $272 million in that pot. I should say the funds are being generated through a cap and trade program, and as APEN and other environmental justice groups, we're opposed to carbon trading because we know that polluters will use that mechanism to exacerbate the toxic hotspots in our communities. And we also know that if there are funds and programs that are supposed to reduce climate pollution in our communities, EJ communities should be first and foremost in line for those types of programs. And so for us, we want to make sure in this year that those investments are landing in our communities, that we are building the capacity of community groups to write these grants so that, if we don't apply, we're not going to get these grants, and to strengthen our coordination regionally and by program. We know that our work to get our programs, our climate programs funded on the ground is more than just getting some dollars on the ground. It's about building a climate justice movement with each other, coordinating across different sectors. So, you have urban forestry people coordinating with energy efficiency and affordable housing people. And those are both like community-based organizations as well as local agencies that run that are then connected to the state agency programs as well as the legislature and how they're funding these. So there's a very complex network of coordination that's happening, and we are at the center of that. So when we get the engagement of communities under these programs, we're engaging agency folks as well. And also that there's many more sectors other than your traditional environmentalists that are involved. And so when oil companies, big oil, attacks our programs, our climate programs, we have many more sectors and groups of folks that are organized to stop those attacks. So we've had to build an outside game, an inside game, and making sure our best ideas are written into the measures and laws in implementing this program. One of the ways that we've organized our coalition, so the Quad is the 4 leading organizations of the SB 535 coalition. It's APEN, the Green Lighting Institute, Coalition for Clean Air, and Public Advocates. And so the 5 priority programs that we identified early on, we have advocates that are part of those programs. So for instance, the energy program, I am coordinating 27 organizations under that energy program with the state agency in charge of spending those funds, $75 million this year under energy. So each of the 5 programs have a similar structure, and so we're learning not just the program, but we're also helping them change the program so that it does indeed benefit our communities when they use these funds, because that's the law. They have to use these funds to benefit environmental justice communities. And so just to close, I have the last 2 slides. There's different types of climate programs out there. So one is carbon trading. So here are 5th graders in front of the Chevron refinery in Richmond, California. I took on a toxic tour. So let's take cap and trade as a carbon program, or a climate program, under the 3 E's. So if the 3 E's were a scorecard, how would carbon trading that Chevron is using, how would they score? In environment, well, we will see that more pollution would be concentrated at source. Under economy, they would continue to have these dangerous jobs, and a lot of the folks that work at the refineries don't live in the community, so there's not local hire there. And in terms of equity, it's higher pollution for people of color and increased health impacts. Under SB 535, if we scored that under the 3 E's, for environment, pollution reduction would happen close to the source, and Arsenio will cover how we're identifying environmental justice communities in California. And so these funds are actually, they have to benefit and be located in those communities. Under economy, there'll be local training, higher career track jobs, local business opportunities. And under equity, we're actually investing in the most underserved communities. And so it's closing that gap. And with that, I will close. Thank you.
Shankar Prasad. Good afternoon. It's nice to be back after a hiatus of about 4 or 5 years to DC, and I see quite a bit of a change, and also it's a privilege to see all the new faces and also have some of the familiar old faces. Hello to Richard, Sue, Bridget, and Bernice. And it's also a privilege to share the podium with EJ giants like Charles and the young leaders of EJ movement in California today. SB 535 is really a dream of mine coming true. I'll highlight the key events of this 5-year journey in about 5 or 7 minutes. I'll do my best. In this journey, very frankly, I learned a lot about myself. And I also learned a lot about others. And I made a lot of good friends, and I also lost a few, unfortunately. Hats off to these individuals. You may recognize many of these names. Without the help of these individuals, the dream could not have come true. Some of these individuals work behind the scenes. Some of them walked with us every step of the way. Some of them joined us as often as they could. You may recall, this is a long history. In 2004, some of you may remember, NEJAC produced a report on cumulative impacts, at which time my staff and I wrote a small a chapter called Pollution Burden Matrix, which was basically a hypothetical approach of how one can conceptualize to evaluate cumulative impacts. Around the same time, the following year, both the NEJAC and the EJ Advisory Committee in California recognized addressing cumulative impacts was the key in order to move forward in the environmental justice arena. And actually, California went a step ahead and finalized a definition for cumulative impacts, not as cumulative risk. There are finite differences between the cumulative risk versus cumulative impacts. And then at the time, I was at AI Air Resources Board, and I had the full support of the chairman. I went and talked to Manuel Pastor, and he agreed, and it was a long, hard talk, and convincing him to develop a methodology called EJ Environmental Justice Screening Method, and with the support of Dr. Alan Lloyd, we got funded that piece. In fact, today, Calanoiva screen, which is much talked about, and Arsenio Mataka will be talking about it. For that, actually, environmental justice screening method is actually the backbone of that. And at around the same time, the Global Warming Solutions Act AB 32 that Marie Rose talked about was in the play. Environmental justice advocates did a very good job. At the last minute, they managed to convince inclusion of 2 words. One is the cumulative impacts and the disadvantaged communities into the language. Because it came into play at the last minute, no definition was given, no specificity was there, but at the same time, there was 2 committees formed. One was the Environmental Justice Advisory Committee for AB 32 and also Economic and Technology Advancement Advisory Committee, which were supposed to provide guidance to the scoping plan. Scoping plan is the plan how the they would be reaching their targets. And at that time, I was at Cali, PA, I was the deputy secretary, and I knew whether, because of the communications with the governor's office and so on and so forth, it was very clear that the cap and trade would be the choice of market mechanism, and it was necessary to proceed in that direction. That was the directive. And at that, around the same time, Hal Harvey from Hewlett, Hal Harvey and Daniel Dean from the Hewlett Foundation were in my office one day, and they talked to me about how this one could think of it, since that would be a big revenue source. And there is some language about cumulative impacts in AB 32, and also disadvantaged communities are mentioned. So what can we do about it? Do you have any suggestions? And it was it took me a few days, and it was at that time I conceived the idea of Community Benefits Fund, and I talked to Tim Carmichael at Coalition for Clean Air, and they provided a fellowship for me to move on and work for develop its details and to work on advocacy for that purpose. Community Benefits Fund is a very simple concept. Basically, it said that identify the disadvantaged communities based on some methodology that was in progress, that was by EJ, Environmental Justice Screening Method. And the second piece was very critical. Since the cap and trade was going on, it was important to put trading restrictions on who can participate in the trade and when one can participate in the trade. Some of you might know the sulfur dioxide acid rain process that went in and which had the trading mechanism, but it was a contained trading, and still it brought about the changes. Though there was trading involved, it did make a big impact in most of the parts of the northeastern United States and some parts of southern states. And the third piece was that since it's a big revenue profile, revenue source, we wanted to make sure that a portion was set aside to benefit the disadvantaged communities. And these funds would be used for emission reduction or energy efficiency projects within that part of it. In fact, we published a paper on that in 2008. The SB 535 took a long time, so actually we could not include the trading restrictions piece of that, but we managed to succeed in getting two pieces into about the allocation of resources. That is, 25% of the funds should benefit the disadvantaged communities, whereas 10% of the funds must be spent within the communities. Those are the two elements of SB 535. We did not, just because they said that, I did not just go ahead and start the advocacy piece of it. We had a serious discussion with these individuals for over a period of days, and all of them kind of came to the conclusion that it is good to move forward, and Coalition for Clean Air should go ahead in its advocacy, and they were some of the strongest supporters over the course of the years. American Lung Association, Latino Issues Forum, Greenlining, NAACP came on board with us soon, immediately. Center on Race, Poverty and Environment, APEN, Asian Pacific Environmental Network, Bay Area District and San Joaquin Air Pollution Control District joined within a month or two. And the rest of the other listed joined a few months later to the group. Interestingly, the community benefits concept had this kind of a supporters, but there was a dichotomy. A good number of environmental justice groups opposed it, and it was primarily because they felt that it was an endorsement of the cap and trade policy. Second, some of them felt that it is trading lives or pollution for money, and some were kind of an extreme, and they said that since the idea was not conceived by an environmental justice group, they would not be supporting it.